So Gewurztraminer is a varietal that in the Finger Lakes and among wine consumers, there is a love-hate relationship. You either love it or you don't. And some of that stems from it's hard to say. For growers, it can be difficult to grow. It can be a little more fickle. It has a tendency to get ripe really fast and to lose acid fast. It has a tendency to develop botrytis because it's got these really tight, thick clusters. But for those who love Gewurztraminer, it offers so much. And from a winemaking perspective, it offers an amazing amount of versatility. If you want to make a big, oily, 15% alcohol white wine, you can. And if you want to make a lean, bright, fresh, citrusy, lychee-influenced Gewurztraminer, you can do that as well. And it's one of the things that led me to make the decision to do a sparkling series of Gewurztraminer. So we look at sparkling wines the way we make them here at the winery in one of two methods. The first method, known as the traditional method, is what we see coming out of Champagne. And you generally will pick fruit a little underripe. You will ferment that to dryness. You will add 24 grams of sugar per liter. You'll bottle that down. That'll ferment in the bottle. Then you'll disgorge, get the yeast and sediment out, and put the cork and the wire hood on. You pick it a little early because when you add that sugar, once that yeast begins to ferment in the bottle, it actually will increase the alcohol content. And you don't want sparkling wines to have too much alcohol. It will destroy the mousse. It will taste off balance on the palate. So you target your base before it goes to bottle to be right around 9.5%, 10%. Because once you have that secondary fermentation, you'll generally get up to 12% alcohol final. What we do with our Sparkling Gewürztraminer series is take two approaches. We'll do some, depending on when we pick it and what the final juice looks like, as traditional method, and we'll do others in what we call the modern method. So we will pick at slightly higher residual sugar, what we call bricks. The potential alcohol on those will be what a standard white wine would be, let's say 12.5%. But rather than letting it ferment to dryness, we monitor the sugar within that wine towards the end of fermentation. And when there is exactly 24 grams per liter of sugar left in the currently fermenting wine, what we'll do at that point is use our specialty cross-flow filter. This is a great tool, and it can take a cloudy, fermenting wine and stop the fermentation by stripping all of the yeast out of it. What we're left with at that point is a base before bottling for sparkling that has the 24 grams per liter of sugar that we need, but it has a broader, more voluptuous kind of palate weight and flavor profile because it was picked later. Once we bottle it, we add the yeast, those natural sugars ferment, and it rests in tirage for a period of time, where the yeast that fermented the wine in the bottle are allowed to decay and break down in a process called autolysis. With autolysis, what we find is those cell walls that were the yeast break apart, and all of the organelles and the amino acids inside are released into the wine. And this can help to change the flavor profile and add a little bit of kind of a brioche note or some almond characteristics. I love that in my sparkling wine. And that's what we have in this 2018 Sparkling Gewürztraminer. So this particular vintage was done closer to the traditional method. It was picked a little earlier. It was fermented with natural ambient yeasts, so we didn't add a yeast culture. It basically, after about a week, kicked off, and we allowed the native yeasts that came from the vineyard and that were in the winery already to ferment. What that does is not allow a single yeast culture to ferment this wine. What happens is we see this wave where multiple yeast cultures come in and die off until it reaches the point where the fermentation stops. Once it stopped, we cleaned it up through the crossflow. We brought the sugar back up to 24 grams per liter, and we allowed this wine to ferment in bottle. When it was disgorged, we added a very small dosage. So we took some base wine from this bottling, we added some sugar, and we did the math, and so that when we added about 5 milliliters of this liqueur to this wine, it brought the residual sugar up. So this one finishes fairly dry. It's right around, I think, 8 grams, so 0.8. So it's not a sweet sparkling wine, but combined with sort of the broadness on the palate, the influence from the native yeast fermentation, and a really nice mousse, this is the sort of wine that I like to say can go with meals or it can go with Netflix. It's versatile, it's delicious, and let's taste it. So we can see a really nice mousse on this wine. This has been open for a little bit too. On the nose, instantly it's clearly Gewurztraminer. You get a little bit of that CO2 from the bubbles, but the lychee fruit is right there. There's a little bit of waxiness that I like, a little bit of almost honeycomb. It has a broad note. I think the more I'm smelling this, it's honeycomb, it's lychee, and there's this subtle hint of just barely ripe red berries. So just barely ripe strawberry, some raspberry. Just gorgeous on the palate. The way that it rests in the palate, the mousse, it's all so well balanced. It doesn't have that sort of bright line searing acidity that you might be used to when you're tasting sparkling wines. It's much more generous. It's got this almost like candied type flavor without tasting sweet. I think the best way I can describe it would be like a fruit cocktail juice, but it's not sugar influenced. I think it's just the blend of how good the natural chemistry levels were in this wine when we picked it and fermented it. The broadness that comes from the autolysis and that period of letting the yeast decay. And then sort of that bright excitement of the sparkling wine, the mousse that just fills the mouth. Overall, I have to say that this is, I talk about hedonistic wines that just offer pure joy. They're just delicious. To me, this is probably the best example that we've made of that. You can pair this with all sorts of things. This is great for everything from banana bread to multiple kinds of cheeses. I think this would make a really great pairing with something like foie gras. This would make a great pairing with goat cheese on salads. You really can't go wrong. I would have this with pork. I probably wouldn't have it with any red meats. But the span of foods that you could pair this delicious sparkling wine with is really broad. But don't make a mimosa with this one. The orange juice will kill it, and you'll miss out on some of the best that I think this wine has to offer.